The Warren County Courthouse smelled like industrial floor wax and damp wool. It was a Tuesday morning. I sat on a rigid wooden bench in the witness waiting room. Through the heavy oak doors, I could hear the low hum of the defense attorneys reviewing their case. Resting on my lap was a thick red accordion folder, the rigid plastic edges dug into my palms. Inside were 412 pages of bank routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, and time-stamped emails. My hands did not shake. My breathing remained steady. I was a state forensic auditor, and I was about to dismantle my own family's financial dynasty. The bailiff pushed the double doors open. Madeline Mason. I stood up, smoothed the front of my charcoal skirt, and walked into the courtroom. Uncle Richard sat at the defense table, wearing a tailored gray suit, whispering to his lawyer. My mother Judith and my younger sister Lauren sat directly behind him in the gallery. When they saw me walk down the center aisle, their smug expressions vanished. The blood drained from my mother's face. Lauren gripped the edge of the wooden pew so hard, her knuckles turned white. They thought they had neutralized me months ago. They had held a formal family meeting to legally excommunicate me from our $4 million family trust. They believed cutting me out of the will would buy my silence. What they failed to understand was basic legal strategy. By legally disinheriting me, they severed my financial conflict of interest. They accidentally made me the most credible, unbiased expert witness the state prosecutor could possibly put on the stand. I did not look away as I walked past them. I raised my right hand, took the oath, sat in the witness box, and set the red folder on the wooden ledge. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance. We tell stories about the black sheep who keep the receipts while their families play mind games. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Let me rewind the clock 6 months to explain exactly how an auditor from Bowling Green ended up holding the match that burned her family down. The Mason family operated like a local monarchy. Uncle Richard ran a lucrative commercial development firm that essentially owned half the city council. My mother was the matriarch of the local country club, treating social standing like a religion. Then there was Lauren. Lauren was 3 years younger and the undeniable golden child. Her life was a series of unconditionally subsidized milestones. When Lauren got married, my mother handed her $40,000 in cash for a venue decorated with imported orchids. When David and I got engaged, my mother suggested we save everyone the trouble and just elope. I never complained about the disparity. In my family, love was a transactional currency. Every financial gift came with an invoice of unspoken obligations. I refused to incur that debt. I paid my own tuition at Western Kentucky University by working nights. I wanted clean ledgers in every aspect of my life. I married David. David is a high school math teacher. He wakes up at 5 in the morning, brews the coffee, and notices everything while saying very little. He never asks me to shrink myself to fit into my family's narrow expectations. I needed his quiet strength because my Uncle Richard treated our family assets like his personal piggy bank. Richard loved to brag at Thanksgiving dinner about leveraging family money to build his empire. I filed that detail away for years. I had no idea how important it would become until the state opened a quiet inquiry into his business practices. The Mason family name carried a specific kind of weight in our corner of Kentucky. It was the kind of weight that made restaurant hosts scramble for the best table and caused traffic citations to quietly disappear from the county clerk records. My mother orchestrated this social theater with the precision of a military general. Judith Mason wore cashmere sweaters even in July and treated the local country club like her personal diplomatic headquarters. Her currency was influence. She smiled with her mouth, never with her eyes, and she expected her daughters to serve as perfect extensions of her pristine image. Lauren understood this assignment from birth. 3 years my junior, she learned early that compliance paid dividends. Lauren played the role of the adoring, dependent daughter, and the family rewarded her with a life insulated from consequence. If she wrecked a car, a new one appeared in the driveway by the weekend. If she overspent her monthly allowance, the bank balance magically reset without a single lecture. I learned a different lesson. I learned that in our household, generosity was a trap. The realization solidified on a humid Tuesday evening when I was 16. I sat at our polished mahogany dining table. Spread out in front of me were stacks of household utility bills, bank statements, and a heavy, leather-bound ledger. The air conditioner hummed above me. My mother stood near the kitchen island, sipping a glass of Chardonnay. She waved a manicured hand toward the paperwork. She told me to balance the accounts because she simply was not good with numbers. She framed it as a chore, but it was an abdication. I punched numbers into a plastic calculator. The digital display blinked back a harsh reality. We were overdrawn on the primary checking account. I opened my mouth to tell her we needed to cut back on expenses this month. Before I could speak the words, the front door swung open. Lauren floated into the foyer. She dropped her designer backpack on the hardwood floor and announced she found the perfect dress for the junior prom. It cost $800. She also needed shoes, professional makeup, and a stretch limousine. She did not ask if we could afford it. She presented it as an impending reality. I looked down at the red ink on the ledger. I looked up at my mother. I waited for Judith to explain the concept of a budget. Instead, my mother set her wine glass down, reached into her leather purse, and pulled out a platinum credit card. She handed the plastic square to Lauren with a warm, indulgent smile. "Have fun shopping, sweetheart." Lauren snatched the card and bounded up the stairs. The silence in the dining room felt heavy. I looked back at the calculator. The deficit stared back at me. In that quiet space, the architecture of my family became crystal clear. Lauren was the investment. I was the accountant expected to clean up the mess. My mother did not value my presence. She valued my utility. I made a silent promise to myself right then. I would never ask them for a single dime. I understood that accepting their money meant handing over the deed to my autonomy. That promise shaped the next decade of my life. While Lauren pledged a top-tier sorority and spent her weekends skiing, I enrolled at Western Kentucky University and worked consecutive night shifts at a local logistics firm. I smelled like stale diner coffee and printer toner for 4 years straight. I studied forensic accounting because numbers do not lie, negotiate, or play favorites. A balance sheet tells the truth. I paid my own tuition, I signed my own lease, I bought a used sedan with cash I saved in a shoelace box under my bed. I built a life they could not repossess. My independence baffled them, but it also made me invisible. Since they could not buy my obedience, they largely ignored me. That was fine. I found my own anchor. I met David during my junior year. He sat in the front row of an advanced statistics lecture. He was quiet, wore faded flannel shirts, and had a habit of tapping his pencil against his notebook when he solved complex equations. We started studying together in the quiet section of the campus library. David did not try to impress me with loud stories or grandiose promises. He just showed up. Every single time he said he would, he was there. We got married in a courthouse ceremony. David became a high school math teacher. Our life together is small, predictable, and deeply safe. I wake up at 5 every morning. The scent of freshly ground dark roast coffee greets me before my feet even hit the floor. David stands in the kitchen, reading the morning paper, holding a warm mug out to me. He watches the way the light catches the frost on the window pane. He never demands that I perform. He never keeps a running tally of who owes what. He is the quiet harbor I return to when the storm of the Mason family threatens to pull me under. The storm always gathered strength around the holidays. Thanksgiving dinners at my grandmother's estate were exercises in psychological endurance. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and expensive Kentucky bourbon. Uncle Richard always sat at the head of the table. Richard was a large man with a booming voice and a smile that felt more like a threat. His commercial development firm was expanding rapidly across the county, securing municipal contracts that squeezed out every independent contractor in the region. Richard loved an audience, After his third glass of bourbon, he would lean back in his chair, unbutton his suit jacket, and hold court. He liked to offer unsolicited financial advice to anyone within earshot. I sat quietly next to David, pushing green beans around my plate, listening. Richard raised his glass one evening and boasted about his latest zoning victory. He told the table that the secret to true wealth was leverage. He proudly announced that he was leveraging family assets to build his empire, treating our grandmother's estate like a personal line of credit to secure corporate commercial loans. He framed it as brilliant business strategy. I watched my mother nod in agreement. I watched Lauren sip her champagne, oblivious to the implications. I set my fork down. As an auditor, the word leverage translates directly to liability. Richard was not just building an empire. He was tying a financial anchor around the neck of every single person sitting at that table. I filed that detail away in the back of my mind. It was a terrifying piece of information, but it did not directly threaten me. I had kept my own ledgers entirely separate. My name was not on any of their accounts. My signature was absent from their limited partnerships. I remained an observer. I thought my firewall was secure. I believed that because I owed them nothing, they held zero power over my trajectory. I was wrong. The problem with a family that runs on transactional loyalty is that they do not know how to handle someone who refuses to play the game. When a person cannot be bought, they become a wild card. They become dangerous. My clean hands made them deeply uncomfortable. They needed me to be indebted to them. They needed a leash. As the state inquiry into Richard's development firm began to quietly gather momentum in the background, the family realized I was stationed inside the very building capable of tearing down their facade. My independence was no longer just an annoyance. It was an active threat. If I did not owe them a debt, they could not control me. Since they possessed no natural leverage, they decided to manufacture a cage. They just needed the right moment to lock the door. Rain lashed against the reinforced safety glass of the state auditor branch in downtown Bowling Green. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of dreary afternoon that makes the fluorescent office lights feel particularly sterile. The air smelled of wet wool coats, ozone from the heavy-duty copy machines, and stale break-room coffee. My cubicle sat in the far back corner. It was a quiet sanctuary built of gray fabric partitions and organized filing cabinets. My desk was a neat landscape of stacked manila folders and color-coded binders. I thrived in this ordered environment. I appreciated the strict predictability of local government finance. My supervisor, Thomas, walked down the narrow carpeted aisle and dropped a thick binder onto my keyboard. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and muttered something about a random spot check on Warren County vendor disbursements. He explained it was a routine municipal zoning contract review, nothing out of the ordinary. My task was simple: match the incoming invoices to the corresponding purchase orders, verify the delivery receipts, and flag any numerical irregularities. I nodded, slid my reading glasses down from my forehead, and broke the metal clasp on the binder. I spread the printed ledgers across the expanse of my desk. The primary contractor, listed in bold black ink on the top sheet, caught my eye immediately. Apex Commercial Development, Uncle Richard's flagship holding company. My pulse ticked up a fraction of a beat, yet my hands remained perfectly steady. I did not stand up. I did not walk back to Thomas to request a reassignment. In my specific line of work, asking for a recusal without prior documentation draws immediate bureaucratic suspicion. Instead, I picked up a yellow highlighter, uncapped my favorite black ink pen, and went to work. Forensic accounting is rarely about uncovering hidden wall safes or intercepting secret briefcases. The job is about identifying negative space. You train your eyes to look for the shadows where the numbers refuse to cast a logical reflection. I started tracing the material requisition forms for a new county transit center currently under construction on the edge of town. The first dozen pages matched without issue. The records showed concrete deliveries, rebar purchases, and logged labor hours that aligned with the municipal budget. Then I turned to the subcontractor payout sheets. A vendor named Bluegrass Supply Holdings appeared frequently in the third quarter columns. They billed Warren County for high-grade industrial steel framing. I pulled up the state corporate registry database on my dual monitor setup. Bluegrass Supply Holdings was incorporated a mere 12 months prior. It was registered to an anonymous agent operating out of a strip mall in Delaware. The company possessed no warehouse address in the state of Kentucky. They had no registered fleet of commercial delivery trucks. They lacked any physical footprint. I cross-referenced the steel delivery dates on the invoices with the project foreman's daily site log. On the specific Tuesdays and Thursdays, when Bluegrass supposedly dropped off 40 tons of structural steel, the foreman had recorded severe rain delays with 0 active site personnel. The materials never arrived. They did not exist. I maintained my focus and kept digging. The fraudulent pattern repeated across 3 separate municipal infrastructure projects: phantom drywall orders, ghost electrical wiring shipments, imaginary heavy machinery landscaping fees. I ran the 10-key adding machine on my desk, my fingers flying across the gray plastic keys by pure muscle memory. The ribbon of white paper curled onto my lap, growing longer with every added invoice. I finally hit the total button, tore the strip of paper off the machine, and stared at the final tally printed in stark black ink. $1.2 million. Richard had double billed the county taxpayers for construction materials that only existed on manipulated spreadsheets. He filtered the illicit municipal funds through the dummy shell company in Delaware, effectively washing the stolen capital before integrating it back into the legitimate accounts of Apex Commercial Development. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The rain continued to beat a steady rhythm against the window pane. I thought about the opulent Thanksgiving dinners at my grandmother's estate. I remembered my uncle leaning back in his expensive dining chair, swirling his bourbon, bragging about leveraging family assets. Now I understood the foundation of his expanding empire. It was built on deliberate, systemic fraud. I faced a distinct choice. I could close the binder, walk into Thomas's office and claim a sudden familial conflict of interest. I could pass the live grenade to another auditor and wash my hands of the inevitable fallout. But doing so would make me complicit in the theft. It would mean honoring the transactional loyalty my mother demanded from birth. It would mean paying a debt I never agreed to owe. I gathered the spreadsheets into a neat stack. I attached the Delaware corporate registry printouts with a binder clip. I stapled the long calculator ribbon to the very front page. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, walked down the hallway, and knocked on Thomas's open door. I set the damning file directly on his desk. I pointed to the final sum. I explained the dummy corporation, the missing materials, and the conflicting weather reports. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes tracking the highlighted lines of evidence. He did not ask if I was certain. The meticulous documentation left no room for hesitation or doubt. He picked up his desk phone and immediately dialed the state prosecutor's office. The wheels of state justice often turn at a glacial pace until they lock on to a clear target. Then they move with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, the state prosecutor filed a sweeping civil lawsuit against Apex Commercial Development. The formal charges outlined systemic municipal fraud and gross misuse of taxpayer funds. The local Bowling Green newspaper ran the explosive story above the fold on the front page of the Sunday edition. My husband David read the headline over his morning coffee. He set the paper down on the granite kitchen island, looked at me, and raised a single eyebrow. I took a slow sip of my dark roast and nodded once. David folded the newspaper in half, slid it neatly into the recycling bin, and turned his attention back to making scrambled eggs. We did not need to discuss the impending storm. We both felt the barometric pressure dropping in the room. The Mason Family Whisper Network activated before noon. My cell phone began to vibrate incessantly on the kitchen counter. I saw missed calls from Aunt Susan. I received cryptic text messages from cousins I had not spoken to in over 3 years, asking if I had seen the news. I ignored every single notification. I spent my Sunday afternoon weeding the front garden and organizing our pantry shelves. I maintained my quiet routine because giving them my attention meant surrendering my power. Night fell across Kentucky. The house grew still and quiet. David went to sleep early, exhausted from grading a stack of advanced calculus exams. I sat alone at the kitchen island under the dim glow of a pendant light, reviewing our monthly household budget. My phone sat face down on the cool stone countertop. At 14 minutes past 11, the screen illuminated. A harsh, white glow spilled across the dark granite. I reached out and picked up the device. I had a single text message from my mother. Richard says you are looking into his accounts. Fix it. 10 words. No greeting. No inquiry into my well-being. It was not a request for professional insight. It was a direct command from a sovereign to a subordinate. My mother genuinely believed she could order me to erase a $1 million felony with the same casual authority she used to order a gin and tonic at the country club bar. She assumed my professional ethics and legal obligations were secondary to her fragile social standing. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. I could have typed a lengthy, emotional explanation. I could have defended my integrity, cited state law, or expressed my profound outrage at her blatant request for corruption. Instead, I locked the screen. I walked down the hall into the small, spare bedroom we had converted into a home office. I woke up my computer and opened a secure digital file. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the text message. I printed it on heavy bond paper. I opened my bottom desk drawer and pulled out a brand new, empty, red accordion folder. I uncapped a bright yellow highlighter and drew a bold, deliberate line across the timestamp, 11:14 p.m. Then I drew a second, thick line across the command, fix it. I slipped the crisp paper into the very first slot of the folder. It was a singular piece of evidence, but it carried profound weight. The boundary had been drawn in permanent ink. The Mason family had officially crossed the line from quiet dysfunction into active criminal conspiracy. They expected me to bury the truth to protect their status. They were about to discover that I was not the same quiet teenager balancing their overdrawn checkbooks. I was the state auditor holding their ledger, and the final bill was hurtling toward their doorstep. Tuesday evening fell over Bowling Green with a quiet, damp chill. The streetlights outside our living room window flickered on, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. Inside, the house smelled of simmering garlic, crushed tomatoes, and roasted olive oil. David sat at the scarred oak dining table, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he graded a stack of geometry midterms. I stood at the stove, stirring the pasta sauce with a wooden spoon, letting the repetitive motion drain the tension of the workday from my shoulders. Our home was small, a modest 3-bedroom ranch we bought with a conventional mortgage, but it was impenetrable. We held the deed, we paid the taxes. No one else owned a single square foot of our sanctuary. The doorbell shattered the quiet. It was not a quick, polite chime. It was a harsh, sustained press, followed immediately by 3 sharp raps against the solid wood frame. David looked up from his papers. His red grading pen paused over a student's test. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, set it on the counter, and walked into the foyer. I looked through the frosted glass pane. 2 figures stood on our welcome mat. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door inward. Uncle Richard stood on the porch wearing a dark cashmere overcoat, his broad shoulders blocking the porch light. My mother, Judith, stood half a step behind him, clutching a designer leather handbag against her chest like a shield. They did not wait for an invitation. Richard stepped across the threshold, bringing the smell of cold rain and expensive cologne into my hallway. He tracked wet leaves onto the hardwood floor without glancing down. Judith followed, her eyes darting around my living room, silently appraising the modest furniture and the lack of crown molding. Richard bypassed the standard pleasantries. He did not ask how my day was. He did not offer a polite excuse for the unannounced intrusion. He marched directly into my kitchen and stopped in front of the polished granite island. He He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a thick, cream-colored document. He dropped it onto the stone surface. The heavy paper landed with a flat, definitive slap. "Read it," he commanded. I walked over to the island. I did not touch the paper immediately. I looked at my mother, who had positioned herself near the refrigerator. She refused to meet my gaze, choosing instead to study a magnetic calendar holding up a grocery list. I shifted my attention to the document. It carried a raised, embossed notary seal in the bottom right corner. The signature belonged to a corporate attorney who frequently played golf at Judith's Country Club. The text consisted of dense, carefully crafted legalese. It was a sworn statement drafted for the state prosecutor's office. The paragraphs outlined a highly specific narrative. It claimed that the state audit of Warren County vendor disbursements was fundamentally flawed. It blamed the $1.2 million discrepancy on a recent server migration error, a phantom digital artifact generated by an outdated SQL database. The final page required my signature. It needed me, the investigating state auditor, to officially recuse myself and certify that the missing municipal funds were nothing more than a technological glitch. It was a brilliant, terrifying lie. The expensive lawyer had constructed a narrative that provided Richard with a perfect scapegoat. The scapegoat was me. If I signed that paper, I would not just be saving my uncle from a federal fraud conviction. I would be confessing to gross professional incompetence. I would torpedo my own career, sacrifice my state license, and permanently destroy my reputation to salvage his empire. Richard leaned over the granite island, placing his large hands flat on the stone. He watched my eyes scan the text. "Just sign the bottom line, Madeline," he said, his voice dropping into a smooth, practiced cadence. "We take this to the judge tomorrow morning, the civil suit gets tossed out, and all of this unpleasantness goes away. Family protects family. You understand that." Judith stepped forward, sensing the need to close the sale. She placed her hand on her leather purse and tilted her head, adopting a tone of wounded maternal disappointment. "You owe him this, Madeline," she said. I looked up from the cream-colored paper. "I owe him nothing." Judith let out a sharp, theatrical sigh. "Do not rewrite history. When you were 12 years old, your teeth were crooked. Your father was between contracts. We had no extra money. Richard wrote a check for $3,000 to the orthodontist so you wouldn't go through high school looking like a train wreck. He paid for your braces. We take care of our own. And now it is your turn to step up." I stared at my mother. The transactional nature of my childhood materialized in the quiet kitchen. The metal wires in my mouth had been a physical reminder of a debt I never asked to incur. For 2 years, she had forced me to write a formal thank you note to Richard every single month. Now, 2 decades later, she was trying to cash in that adolescent dental work for a felony perjury charge. They viewed my integrity as a cheap commodity they had purchased on an installment plan. I reached out and placed my index finger on the document. I slid it slowly across the smooth granite, pushing it back toward Richard. I kept my breathing slow and even. I did not blink. "This is perjury," I said, my voice dropping to an ice-cold register. "The answer is no." The polite, smooth-talking uncle vanished. The mask slipped, revealing the ruthless, cornered developer underneath. The skin around his shirt collar turned a dark, mottled red. The veins in his neck pushed against his skin. He slammed his fist onto the island, making the ceramic salt shaker rattle against the stone. "You ungrateful little bureaucrat," Richard snarled. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? I play golf with the governor. I fund the campaigns of the judges in this county. I can make one phone call and have your state pension vaporized. I will ensure you never work in finance in the state of Kentucky again. You will sign this paper, or I will ruin you." The threat hung in the air, heavy and venomous. Before Richard could draw another breath, the scrape of a wooden chair echoed through the house. David stood up from the dining table. He did not rush. He did not posture, puff out his chest, or raise his voice. He walked into the kitchen with the calm, measured stride of a man who possesses total ownership of his environment. He bypassed me entirely and stepped directly in front of Richard. David picked up the notarized sworn statement. He folded the heavy cream paper neatly in half. He pressed the crease down with his thumb. He handed the folded document back to my uncle. Richard stared at the paper, momentarily stunned by the sheer lack of deference. David turned his back on the developer, walked down the short hallway to the front door, and grasped the brass deadbolt. He turned the lock, pulled the heavy oak door wide open, and stepped to the side. The cold night air rushed into the foyer. David stood on the threshold. He looked directly at Richard. He did not utter a single syllable. He did not need to. The stoic silence was a physical wall, an immovable boundary that no amount of country club money could breach. Richard operated by buying power, but David simply held it. Richard snatched the folded document from the counter. He glared at me, his eyes promising retribution, before storming down the hallway and marching out the front door. Judith hurried after him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood. She cast one final venomous look over her shoulder. "You are making a terrible mistake, Madeline," she hissed. David pulled the door shut, the deadbolt engaged with a firm, metallic snap. The sudden quiet in the house felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I walked over to the stove and turned off the burner beneath the pasta sauce. I wiped my hands on the towel again. I did not cry. I did not tremble. I felt a strange, profound sense of clarity. The polite fiction of the Mason family had just evaporated, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. I walked down the hall to the spare bedroom. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the red accordion folder. I flipped to the second tab. I uncapped my black pen and began to write. I logged the exact time of the intrusion, 7:42 p.m. I listed the attendees. I documented the physical presentation of the pre-written affidavit. I wrote down the exact phrasing of the software glitch narrative. Most importantly, I transcribed Richard's specific verbal threat regarding the governor and my state pension. I slid the fresh notes behind the printed text message from my mother. The ledger of their betrayal was growing thicker. They had attempted to leverage a childhood favor to force my signature on a fraudulent document. They failed to intimidate me in my own kitchen. They failed to bypass my husband. I closed the drawer and turned off the desk lamp. I knew my uncle's playbook. Since they could not buy my compliance and they could not bully me into submission, they only had one tactical maneuver left. They were going to sever me from the herd. The social execution was about to begin, and the venue they chose would be designed to inflict maximum public humiliation. 14 days passed. The silence from the Mason family was total. No missed calls appeared on my phone screen. No unannounced vehicles pulled into my driveway. No forwarded emails landed in my inbox. In a dysfunctional family system, silence is never an indicator of peace. Silence is a tactical maneuver. It is the deliberate drawing back of a bowstring. Lauren was due to have her first child in 2 months. Her baby shower had been marked on my digital calendar for half a year. The event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the Bowling Green Country Club, a venue requiring a steep annual membership and enforcing a strict dress code. I had already purchased a hand-knit cashmere blanket from a small boutique in Louisville. The blanket sat neatly in a pristine white gift box on top of my bedroom dresser. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp, clear autumn chill. I stood at the kitchen island, sipping a dark roast coffee, watching the frost melt off the window panes. At precisely 10 o'clock, my cell phone vibrated against the cool granite countertop. It was not a private text message. It was a notification from the extended family group chat. This digital thread contained 32 members, encompassing aunts, uncles, first cousins, and grandparents scattered across 3 different states. Lauren was the author of the new message. I opened the application. Her words sat at the very bottom of the screen, a neat block of black text enclosed in a gray bubble. We are so excited to celebrate the new baby today. We only want positive, loyal energy surrounding our growing family. Sadly, Madeline has chosen to attack Uncle Richard with baseless accusations, so she will not be joining us. We ask that everyone respect our privacy and focus on the joy of the day. The notification was a public execution. Lauren did not simply uninvite me. She excommunicated me in front of our entire bloodline. By framing my absence as a choice to attack the family, she drew a definitive line in the sand. Any relative who reached out to me, any cousin who dared to send a supportive text, would be instantly categorized as disloyal. She weaponized her unborn child to shield a corporate fraudster. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. I did not reply to the group chat. I did not type a frantic defense. I watched the read receipts pop up one by one as aunts and cousins viewed the message. No one responded. No one asked for my side of the story. The digital silence mirrored the quiet in my kitchen. By 2 p.m, the photographic evidence of my exile began flooding social media. I sat at my desk and pulled up my feed. The Bowling Green Country Club looked immaculate. The banquet room featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th hole. Tables were draped in heavy white linen. Tall glass vases overflowed with imported white hydrangeas and blush pink peonies. Waiters in dark vests carried silver trays of crystal champagne flutes. I scrolled past a photo of Judith, holding a glass, beaming at the camera. I scrolled past a photo of Uncle Richard, wearing a tailored navy blazer, standing with his arm draped protectively over Lauren's shoulders. He looked like the benevolent patriarch, untouched by the civil lawsuit hovering over his commercial empire. I stopped scrolling when I reached the focal point of the gift table. It was a towering 5-tier diaper cake. It was a popular trend, constructed of rolled newborn diapers stacked like a tiered wedding cake, bound tightly together by thick satin ribbons and decorated with expensive silver rattles. Judith, Lauren, and Richard stood directly behind it, posing for the photographer. I stared at the glowing screen. The diaper cake was the perfect, unintentional metaphor for the Mason family. On the outside, it was wrapped in pristine silk ribbon, carefully arranged to project an image of wealth, purity, and perfection. But the structural core was composed entirely of items designed to conceal human waste. It was a beautiful facade built around garbage. A familiar ache bloomed in my chest. It was the specific grief of a daughter, recognizing that her mother preferred a comfortable lie over a difficult truth. I refused to let the grief paralyze me. Crying over the rejection would mean acknowledging that they held power over my emotional state. I closed the social media application. I left the hand-knit cashmere blanket in its box upstairs. I picked up my car keys and walked out the front door. I drove to a commercial office supply store located on the commercial bypass. I ignored the stationery aisles and walked straight to the heavy equipment section. I did not buy tissues or comfort food. I purchased a commercial-grade, cross-cut paper shredder capable of destroying 20 sheets of paper at once, including thick credit cards and optical discs. I then drove to a hardware surplus store across town. I purchased a biometric, fireproof document safe weighing 85 pounds. I asked the clerk to help me load the heavy steel cube into the trunk of my sedan. When I pulled back into my driveway, I noticed a silver aluminum ladder leaning against the front gutter. David was standing 3 rungs up, wearing a faded gray sweatshirt and a canvas tool belt. He held a cordless power drill in his right hand. He was running a thick, black, weatherproof cable along the trim of the roofline. I parked the car and stepped out onto the concrete. I looked up at the eaves. Mounted directly above our front door was a sleek, high-definition, motion-activated security camera. I glanced toward the side gate. A second camera was bolted to the brick fascia, angled to cover the perimeter of our backyard. I walked up the driveway. David climbed down the ladder, wiped a streak of drywall dust from his forehead, and met my gaze. He did not ask how I was feeling about the baby shower. He did not ask if I had seen the photos of my mother toasting my uncle. He knew the Masons. He knew that Richard's failed attempt to bully me in our kitchen was not the end of the war. It was merely the opening skirmish. David understood that a family willing to commit perjury would not hesitate to cross physical boundaries when they felt cornered. He saw the threat vector, and he quietly sealed our perimeter. He took the heavy fireproof safe from my trunk, carried it into the house, and bolted it directly to the concrete foundation in the floor of my home office closet. I sat down at my desk. I turned on my laser printer. I took a high-resolution screenshot of Lauren's group chat message, capturing the exact time and date. I printed it on heavy bond paper. I printed the photographs of Richard and Judith smiling behind the diaper cake. I opened the bottom desk drawer and pulled out the red accordion folder. The folder was becoming a tangible archive of their psychological warfare. I bought a pack of heavy-duty plastic divider tabs. I labeled the first tab with a black marker. I slid the fresh evidence behind the thick plastic barrier. Every act of manipulation, every calculated attempt to isolate me, was stripped of its emotional power and transformed into a cold, hard receipt. They thought they were punishing me with exile. They believed that cutting me off from their social capital would force me to crawl back on my hands and knees, begging for an invitation to the next holiday dinner. They were operating under a fundamental miscalculation. Exile is only a punishment if you long to return. When you stop desiring a seat at a toxic table, exile transforms into a fortress. The heavy steel safe rested in my closet. The cameras blinked with steady red lights above my doors. The shredded remnants of old junk mail filled the plastic bin beneath my desk. I was fortified. Fortresses are designed to be tested. The Masons soon realized that passive isolation was failing to break my resolve. The quiet exclusion of a baby shower was merely a social penalty. They needed a tactical advantage capable of penetrating my defenses. The psychological pressure was preparing to breach my professional boundaries. The whispers were starting to escape the confines of the country club, and a panicked phone call from an anxious relative was about to reveal a dangerous new angle of attack. The psychological siege of the Mason family did not rely on a single, overwhelming strike. It was a war of attrition, designed to slowly erode my endurance through constant, invisible pressure. By the third week of November, the isolation began to alter the atmosphere inside my own home. The quiet that once felt like a sanctuary started to feel like a holding cell. I spent my days at the auditor branch, poring over municipal ledgers, dissecting the fraudulent framework of Apex commercial development. I spent my evenings waiting for the next inevitable retaliation. The retaliation arrived on a Wednesday night, delivered through the digital speaker of my smartphone. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at the frost forming on the window pane, when the voicemail notification chimed. The screen displayed a contact name I had not seen in months. Aunt Susan. Susan was my mother's younger sister. In the rigid hierarchy of our family, Susan served as the designated emotional enforcer. While Judith issued the commands, Susan was deployed to handle the guilt. She specialized in tears, nostalgia, and the weaponization of shared history. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. Susan did not bother with a greeting. Her voice trembled, thick with manufactured grief. The audio carried the distinct echo of a tiled bathroom, suggesting she had locked herself away to make the call. "Madeline, please tell me this is a misunderstanding," she wept. "Your mother is inconsolable. Richard is facing a federal indictment. The entire town is talking. You are tearing the foundation of this family apart over a bureaucratic technicality." I listened to her ragged breathing. I did not move. Susan lowered her voice to a theatrical whisper. "Think about your father, Madeline. Think about what he built. He worked his entire life to ensure the Mason name commanded respect in Bowling Green. If you proceed with this audit, if you take the stand, you will ruin your father's memory. Just apologize. Sign the paper Richard brought you. Fix this before the damage is permanent." The recording clicked off. The kitchen plunged back into silence. The invocation of my father felt like a physical blow. He passed away from a sudden cardiac arrest 5 years ago. He was a quiet, pragmatic man who ran a modest hardware distribution company. He spent his life avoiding the chaotic social theater my mother craved. He prized integrity above wealth. Susan was twisting his legacy, using a dead man's reputation as a crowbar to pry open my defenses. It was a vile tactic, but it was effective. A cold, heavy stone of doubt settled in the pit of my stomach. I set the phone down on the granite counter and walked down the hallway toward the living room. The television was muted, playing a black and white film. David sat in his worn leather armchair. A stack of high school geometry exams rested on his lap. He was sound asleep, his head tilted against the wingback cushion. A red grading pen had slipped from his relaxed fingers, resting on the carpet near his boot. I stood in the doorway and studied my husband. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent. The lines around his mouth seemed deeper than they had a month ago. He was exhausted. David carried a heavy teaching load, managed the math department budget, and coached the junior varsity debate team. He did not ask to be drafted into a psychological war with local aristocrats. He did not ask to spend his weekends mounting security cameras to our roofline or turning away angry developers at our front door. He was absorbing the collateral damage of my bloodline. A profound, suffocating sense of guilt washed over me. I was the one who refused to sign the affidavit. I was the one who drew the line in the sand. I was punishing the only person who offered me unconditional safety. If I maintained my current trajectory, the Masons would inevitably target David. They would find a way to jeopardize his teaching career or drag his name through the local mud. I could not allow my toxic lineage to poison his pristine life. I turned away from the living room. I walked quietly down the hall and entered my home office. I sat in my ergonomic chair and woke up my dual monitor setup. I opened a blank word processing document. I placed my fingers on the keyboard. The cursor blinked rhythmically against the stark white background. I began to type. I addressed the letter to Thomas, my branch supervisor. I utilized standard bureaucratic formatting. I stated that due to unforeseen personal and familial circumstances, I was formally tendering my resignation from the state auditor's office, effective immediately. I cited an irreconcilable conflict of interest regarding the ongoing investigation into Apex Commercial Development. I requested that the Warren County vendor disbursement file be reassigned to a neutral investigator. My logic was straightforward. If I removed myself from the board, I ceased to be the linchpin of the prosecution. The state would assign a new auditor to verify my findings. Richard could no longer claim I was pursuing a family vendetta. The crosshairs would shift away from my household, the Masons would lose their primary target, and David would be safe. I typed my digital signature at the bottom of the page. I exported the document as a secure PDF file. I opened my state email client and attached the resignation letter. I typed Thomas's name into the recipient bar. I moved my right hand to the computer mouse. I hovered the digital arrow directly over the blue send button. My pulse pounded in my ears. The weight of the decision pressed down on my chest. Pressing that button meant surrendering my career. It meant allowing my mother and my uncle to win. It meant confirming that their money and their influence could override the rule of law. But it also meant buying peace for my husband. My index finger rested on the plastic mouse button. I closed my eyes. A sharp, sudden vibration rattled the surface of my desk. I opened my eyes. My smartphone screen illuminated, displaying a new text message notification. It was not an email from work. It was a direct message from my sister, Lauren. I picked up the device. I unlocked the screen and read the text. Hope you are enjoying your miserable, lonely life. Uncle Richard always said you were a failure disguised as an accountant. You will never be one of us. I stared at the glowing letters. The cruelty was untethered from any strategic logic. It was pure, unadulterated venom. Lauren did not send the message to protect the family or shield Richard from a federal indictment. She sent it to inflict pain. She sent it because she felt untouchable. She believed she possessed the divine right to mock me from the safety of her country club pedestal. The sheer audacity of the insult acted like a bucket of ice water. The suffocating guilt evaporated. The fog of doubt burned away in a matter of seconds. I looked at the words again. A failure disguised as an accountant. I looked back at my computer monitor. The blue send button waited for my command. Resigning would not protect David. Retreating would not buy peace. Handing a victory to tyrants only guarantees that they will demand more territory. If I quit my job, they would not stop. They would view my resignation as proof of their ultimate superiority. They would spend the rest of my life reminding me that they possess the power to break me. I moved the digital arrow away from the send button. I clicked the trash can icon. The draft email vanished. I dragged the PDF file into the digital recycle bin and emptied it. The resignation letter was gone. I picked up my smartphone. I connected it to the laser printer on the corner of my desk. I printed Lauren's text message. I opened my digital voicemail application, transcribed Aunt Susan's weeping, manipulative audio file word for word, and printed that document as well. I reached into the bottom drawer and retrieved the red accordion folder. I punched 2 holes into the fresh sheets of paper and secured them behind the third plastic divider tab. I smoothed my hand over the heavy cover of the folder. I was not quitting. I was not retreating. I was going to finish the audit, and I was going to follow the numbers wherever they led. The Masons had exhausted their emotional arsenal. The guilt trips failed, the isolation failed, the insults failed. They realized I was immune to their social currency. When a family built on transactional loyalty realizes they cannot manipulate your emotions, they default to the only weapon they truly understand. They move to restrict your capital. A few days later, a thick, cream-colored envelope would arrive in my mailbox, signaling a drastic escalation. They were preparing to sever my financial lifeline, unaware that their next aggressive maneuver would legally insulate me from the very disaster they were trying to avoid. The formal email arrived on a Tuesday morning. It bypassed my personal inbox and landed directly in my state government account. The subject line contained a single word: summons. The sender was Gregory Sterling, a senior partner at a corporate law firm that handled the Mason family estate. The body of the message was brief and stripped of any familial warmth. It dictated that my presence was required at my grandmother's residence the following afternoon at 4 o'clock. The phrasing indicated a mandatory appearance regarding the immediate restructuring of our financial trusts. I did not reply to the email. I printed it, placed it into the red folder, and submitted a request for 2 hours of personal leave for Wednesday afternoon. My grandmother's estate sat on 12 acres of pristine land on the affluent south side of Bowling Green. A long, winding driveway paved with crushed white gravel led to a sprawling brick colonial mansion. Century-old oak trees lined the property, their bare autumn branches casting skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns. I parked my modest sedan near the front steps, flanked by Richard's imported sports car and my mother's luxury SUV. I walked up the brick steps and pushed the heavy front door open. The foyer smelled of lemon oil polish, old money, and burning cedar from the living room fireplace. I did not bother taking off my coat. I walked straight down the central hallway and entered the formal dining room. The scene resembled a corporate tribunal. The long mahogany dining table dominated the space. Uncle Richard sat at the head of the table, wearing a dark tailored suit, his hands folded neatly over a leather binder. My mother, Judith, sat to his right, staring intently at the crystal water glass in front of her. Lauren sat beside Judith, idly examining her manicured fingernails with a faint, satisfied smile resting on her lips. Gregory Sterling, the estate attorney, sat across from them. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and organized a stack of legal documents with precise, calculated movements. An empty wooden chair waited at the opposite end of the table. I pulled it out and sat down. I kept my posture straight and rested my hands on my lap. Richard cleared his throat. He did not offer a greeting. He leaned forward, letting the silence stretch for several seconds to establish his authority. "We called you here today to address a breach of trust," Richard began, his voice echoing off the high plaster ceiling. "This family operates as a unified entity. Our financial holdings are structured to protect our collective interests. Decades ago, your grandfather established the Mason Family Limited Partnership to consolidate our wealth and ensure generational stability. I knew the structure well. The partnership held the deeds to the estate, several commercial properties, and a substantial portfolio of liquid investments. The total valuation hovered around $4 million. As a direct descendant, I held a 25% equity stake in the entity." Richard tapped his index finger against the leather binder. "The partnership agreement contains a specific morality and loyalty clause," he continued. "It dictates that no member of the partnership may engage in actions that actively harm the business interests, reputation, or financial standing of the managing partner. I am the managing partner. Your current crusade at the auditor's office is a direct violation of that clause." He gestured toward the attorney. Gregory Sterling slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the polished mahogany surface. The documents came to a halt a few inches from my hands. "Because you have chosen to weaponize your career against your own blood, the remaining partners have held a formal vote," Richard stated. "We are exercising our legal right to trigger a hostile buyout of your shares." I looked down at the paperwork. The contract outlined a forced restructuring. They were removing my name from the family limited partnership. Due to the punitive nature of the loyalty clause, the buyout valuation was subject to severe administrative penalties. They were not offering me my rightful quarter of the $4 million estate. They were offering me a fraction of a fraction. They were executing a buyout for pennies on the dollar, effectively stripping me of my entire inheritance. The subtext hung heavy in the dining room air. The paperwork was a guillotine hovering over my financial future. They expected me to panic. They assumed the sheer terror of losing $1 million inheritance would shatter my resolve. The unspoken ultimatum was clear. Drop the state audit, sign the fake software glitch affidavit, and the buyout documents would disappear into the nearest fireplace. Lauren leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with undisguised triumph. "You brought this on yourself," she whispered. I ignored my sister. I did not reach for a pen. I did not plead for reconsideration. Instead, I focused my attention entirely on the estate attorney. I needed to verify the mechanical reality of the contract sitting in front of me. "Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional, "I need you to confirm the exact legal parameters of this severance. If this vote is certified and these documents are executed, does it constitute a total dissolution of my relationship with the family limited partnership?" The lawyer adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes, you will be formally scrubbed from the entity." I maintained eye contact with him. "Does that severance apply to both assets and liabilities? Am I fully insulated from any debt, corporate collateral obligations, or legal judgments leveraged against the partnership by the managing member?" Sterling blinked, slightly taken aback by the forensic nature of the question. He glanced at Richard, then looked back at me. "That is correct. You will have no claim to the assets, and you will bear zero responsibility for any liabilities incurred by the partnership. It is a clean, permanent break." I nodded slowly. The pieces of the puzzle locked into perfect alignment. I shifted my gaze to my mother. Judith still refused to look at me. She kept her eyes glued to the crystal glass, her jaw tight, her shoulders rigid. She was the matriarch who valued image above oxygen. She was choosing to sit by while her brother robbed her eldest daughter, all to preserve her standing at the country club. "Is this your vote, Mom?" I asked. My voice was quiet, lacking any trace of anger or sorrow. Judith flinched. The question required her to own her cowardice in the bright light of day. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table. She did not raise her head. She simply gave a single, rigid nod. The final thread of my familial obligations snapped. I stood up. I pushed the heavy wooden chair back into place. I did not take the paperwork. I looked at the three people sitting across the room. Noted, I said. I turned around and walked out of the formal dining room. I walked down the central hallway, stepped out into the crisp autumn air, and got into my car. I started the engine and drove down the long gravel driveway. As I pulled onto the main road, a profound sense of clarity settled over me. The dramatic irony of the situation was almost intoxicating. Richard, Judith, and Lauren sat in that dining room acting smug, believing they had just ruined my life. They thought cutting me out of the $4 million estate was the ultimate punishment. They failed to realize that their greed had blinded them to the impending reality of the state lawsuit. I remembered Richard's arrogant boast during Thanksgiving dinner years ago. He bragged about leveraging family assets to build his empire. My forensic trace at the auditor's office confirmed that boast. Richard had secretly used the family limited partnership as collateral to secure the fraudulent commercial loans for his dummy shell companies. When the state prosecutor inevitably won the fraud case, the judge would levy millions of dollars in restitution and fines against Richard. Because Richard tied those crimes directly to the family trust, the state would pierce the corporate veil. They would seize the estate. They would liquidate the properties. They would drain every single bank account associated with the partnership. By voting me out of the entity to punish me, my family had just permanently severed my personal liability from Richard's sinking ship. They legally scrubbed my name from the collateral. They thought they were throwing me overboard into freezing water. In reality, they had just handed me the only functional lifeboat on a doomed vessel, chaining themselves to the heavy iron anchor in the process. I smiled for the first time in weeks. The financial threat was neutralized. However, Richard was a predator, accustomed to winning. When he realized that seizing my inheritance failed to force my signature on the fake affidavit, his desperation would mutate. Since he could no longer threaten me with poverty, he would attempt to seduce me with sudden wealth. He would aim his next weapon at the quietest person in my life, assuming every man possessed a secret price tag. A highly sophisticated bribe was already being drafted, and it was heading straight for David. The days following the formal severance from the family trust felt remarkably light. Uncle Richard operated under a severe miscalculation. He projected his own values onto my psyche. In his mind, wealth was the only metric of human worth. He assumed that stripping me of a multi-million-dollar inheritance would leave me paralyzed with financial panic. He believed I was sitting in my modest ranch house, calculating my losses, desperate for a lifeline. He was wrong, but his arrogance made him predictable. Since the stick failed to break my spine, he decided to offer a very expensive carrot. As the state lawsuit inched closer to the formal discovery phase, Richard shifted his tactics from overt intimidation to sophisticated bribery. He recognized that I would never accept a direct payment from his accounts. My professional firewall was too thick. So he aimed his next weapon at the quietest person in the room. He targeted David. The strike occurred on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was working from my home office reviewing municipal tax codes when a bonded courier pulled a delivery van into our driveway. The driver walked up the front steps and rang the doorbell. I signed the electronic clipboard and received a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. The shipping label displayed a return address from a corporate logistics firm located in Chicago. The recipient line bore David's full legal name. I left the package on the kitchen island. David arrived home an hour later, setting his canvas briefcase near the door. He noticed the rigid envelope, broke the adhesive seal, and slid the contents onto the granite countertop. It was a formal employment contract. The document was printed on heavy, watermarked parchment paper, bound inside a navy blue presentation folder. The header displayed the logo of an organization called the Vanguard Educational Initiative. David read the cover letter out loud. The text praised his exemplary tenure as a public school mathematics educator. It stated that Vanguard was launching a new corporate training division and required a seasoned curriculum director to design their internal statistical modeling courses. The position required a mere 10 hours of remote consulting work per month. Then David turned to the compensation page. The numbers printed in bold black ink defied standard logic. The firm was offering an annual retainer of $100,000. Furthermore, the contract included a staggering $50,000 upfront signing bonus, payable immediately upon execution of the document. A cashier's check for the bonus amount was paperclipped to the back page. David is a high school teacher in the public school system. He spends his own meager salary buying graphing calculators and graph paper for students who cannot afford school supplies. $50,000 represented a life-changing sum of money for an educator. It was a golden ticket, perfectly disguised as a legitimate career opportunity. David stared at the cashier's check. He did not smile. He did not reach for a pen to sign his name. He slowly slid the navy blue folder across the granite island toward me. I pulled my reading glasses down from my forehead and examined the document. The presentation was flawless. The corporate branding looked authentic. The legal jargon was dense and professional. However, forensic auditors do not look at logos. We look at routing numbers. I carried the contract into my home office and sat at my dual-monitor workstation. I instructed David to make a pot of coffee. I needed to dissect the anatomy of this miraculous job offer. I started with the cashier's check. The issuing bank was a regional branch located in southern Illinois. I typed the 9-digit routing number into a secure financial tracking database. The inquiry returned a corporate holding account registered to the Vanguard Educational Initiative. I pivoted to the State Registry of Commerce to pull the articles of incorporation for Vanguard. The paper trail grew murky, which is the universal hallmark of a shell company. Vanguard was registered as a limited liability corporation in Nevada, a state notorious for shielding corporate ownership identities. The listed registered agent was a generic post office box in Las Vegas. A novice investigator might hit a dead end at the state line. I simply dug deeper into the secondary financial layers. I requested the digital property tax records for the Chicago address listed on the courier envelope. The logistics firm leasing that office suite paid their monthly commercial rent through a secondary holding company named Bluegrass Supply Holdings. The name flashed across my screen like a neon warning sign. Bluegrass Supply Holdings was the exact dummy corporation Richard used to double bill the county taxpayers for phantom construction materials. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The entire scheme unraveled in front of my eyes. The Vanguard Educational Initiative did not exist. There was no corporate training division. There were no statistical modeling courses to design. Richard was attempting to launder a $50,000 bribe through my husband's spotless professional record. He structured the payoff as a legitimate consulting bonus. He calculated that if David cashed the check, our household would be legally compromised. We would become accessories to money laundering. Once the funds hit our joint checking account, Richard would own us. He would use the illicit transaction to force my recusal from the state audit. It was a brilliant, highly sophisticated trap. I did not call my uncle to confront him. Expressing outrage only informs your enemy that their psychological warfare is effective. I stood up and walked to the hallway linen closet. I retrieved a box of blue nitrile surgical gloves. I snapped the latex over my fingers and walked back to the kitchen island. I carefully picked up the contract, the navy blue presentation folder, the cover letter, and the cashier's check. I slid every piece of paper into a clear, gallon-sized plastic evidence bag. I sealed the zipper across the top. I walked back to my office, printed my forensic routing trace that definitively linked the bribe to Apex Commercial Development, and placed the printed trace into a second plastic bag. I grabbed my car keys, walked past David in the kitchen, and told him I would be back in an hour. I drove directly to the state prosecutor's office in downtown Bowling Green. The autumn sky was turning a bruised purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. I walked through the heavy glass doors and requested an immediate meeting with the lead investigator assigned to the Apex fraud case. I sat in a sterile, windowless conference room. I placed the clear plastic bags on the metal table. I explained the timeline. I detailed the routing numbers. I pointed to the cashier's check. I formally submitted the fraudulent consulting contract as physical evidence of a severe felony. My uncle had moved beyond municipal zoning infractions. He was now actively engaging in witness tampering and attempted bribery of a state official's spouse. The lead investigator took notes, his expression hardening with every detail I provided. I left the prosecutor's office and drove home. The streetlights flickered against the damp pavement. I felt a deep, resonant calm settling into my bones. The trap was set. Richard handed the state the exact rope they needed to hang his entire operation. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the warmth of the foyer. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air. David was standing in the kitchen wiping a cutting board with a cloth. 2 plates were set at the dining table. A bottle of red wine was open on the counter. David poured a generous measure of Cabernet Sauvignon into a crystal glass. He walked over and handed it to me. His eyes studied my face, searching for any lingering trace of anxiety or doubt. "Did you nail him?" David asked, his voice steady and low. I took a slow sip of the dark wine. I let the rich, complex flavor coat my tongue. I lowered the glass and nodded my head once. The quiet triumph in the kitchen felt profound. We had neutralized the financial threat, dismantled the bribery attempt, and secured our perimeter. We were winning the quiet war. But a narcissist denied control will inevitably seek to destroy the object they cannot subjugate. Richard and Judith realized they could neither bully nor buy my silence. Their private maneuvers had all ended in failure. To regain their power, they needed to change the battlefield. They needed to strip away my professional credibility before I could take the witness stand. The quiet war was about to become very loud, very public, and deeply personal. The matriarch of the country club was preparing to launch a character assassination campaign that would threaten the very foundation of my livelihood. The failure of the consulting bribe signaled a dangerous shift in the Mason family's strategy. They recognized that private coercion was useless against a locked door and a digital paper trail. If they could not force me to change the narrative from the inside, they needed to destroy the narrator from the outside. Uncle Richard retreated to the shadows to manage his impending federal indictment. The mantle of aggression passed directly to my mother. Judith understood the local ecosystem of Bowling Green better than anyone. She knew that in a town built on generational wealth and social standing, a damaged reputation was far more lethal than a depleted bank account. She initiated a scorched earth character assassination campaign designed to systematically dismantle my professional credibility before I ever set foot inside a courtroom. The campaign began with a slow, toxic drip of curated whispers. I experienced the first symptom on a Tuesday morning in early December. I stopped at a small independent bakery near the town square. The owner, a woman named Clara, had supplied the bread for David's high school debate team fundraisers for the past 5 years. Clara was usually bright and talkative, eager to discuss local politics or the upcoming winter weather. Today, she stood behind the glass pastry counter, her posture stiff, her eyes darting nervously toward the front door. I ordered my usual black coffee and a blueberry scone. Clara rang up the purchase, her hands moving with uncharacteristic hesitation. She handed me my receipt, leaned across the glass counter, and lowered her voice to a concerned whisper. "Madeline," Clara said, her brow furrowed in deep distress, "I just want you to know that David and I are keeping you in our prayers. If you ever need a quiet place to sit or someone to talk to during your recovery, the back booth is always open." I stared at her. I paused with the white paper bag halfway to my coat pocket. "Recovery from what, Clara?" Clara blinked, looking genuinely surprised. "From the nervous breakdown. Your mother was at the Rotary Club meeting last Thursday. She was in tears. She told everyone you were taking a leave of absence from the state auditor's office because the financial stress of being removed from the family estate triggered a severe mental health crisis." The air in the bakery felt suddenly thin. Clara bit her lower lip, clearly uncomfortable, but compelled to share the rest. She said the stress made you dangerously paranoid. She claimed you were inventing wild delusions about your Uncle Richard because you were so intensely jealous of your sister Lauren's pregnancy. I stood motionless on the tiled floor. The sheer architectural brilliance of the lie was breathtaking. Judith had constructed a narrative that neutralized every single threat I posed to the family. By branding me mentally unstable, she instantly discredited my forensic audit. By citing jealousy over Lauren's pregnancy, she painted my actions as the bitter vengeance of a barren, disinherited daughter. By framing her own slander as maternal concern, she secured the sympathy of the entire country club board and the local church congregation. I did not raise my voice. I did not unleash a frantic defense of my sanity. Clara was a pawn in Judith's social war, and screaming at a baker would only confirm the very instability my mother was advertising. I took a slow, steady breath. "Clara," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level, "I have not taken a leave of absence. I am currently heading to my office to lead a departmental meeting. I am in excellent health. My mother is spreading a fabricated narrative to protect my uncle from an ongoing federal investigation." Clara's eyes widened. She slowly wiped her hands on her flour-dusted apron. "Oh my God." I looked directly into her eyes. "Clara, did my mother send you any text messages regarding this fabricated breakdown?" Clara nodded slowly. "Yes. She sent a mass message to the Rotary Club Steering Committee on Friday morning, asking for privacy and prayers for your condition." I reached into my purse, pulled out a pen, and wrote my personal cell phone number on the back of the bakery receipt. "Please forward that message to me. Do not reply to her. Just send me the text." I left the bakery and drove to my office. The insidious nature of a smear campaign is that the damage is often invisible until the structural integrity of your life begins to crack. The whispers moved through the affluent circles of Bowling Green like a virus, infecting the perception of everyone I interacted with. The real damage materialized 2 days later. Alongside my state job, I maintained a very small, selective private practice, preparing complex tax returns for a handful of independent local businesses. It was a lucrative side income that David and I used to fund our modest retirement accounts. I received an email from my oldest private client, the owner of a regional landscaping firm. The email was polite, brief, and devastating. The owner informed me that they were transferring their accounts to a larger accounting firm across town. They cited a desire for a different corporate direction. However, the landscaping owner was a prominent member of Judith's country club. The subtext was impossible to miss. No business owner trusts their financial livelihood to an auditor currently branded as a paranoid, vengeful liability by her own mother. The injustice was infuriating. The urge to fight back publicly was a physical ache in my chest. I wanted to log on to social media, post the routing numbers, expose the dummy LLCs, and scream the truth from the digital rooftops. I wanted to burn my mother's pristine reputation to ash in the town square. But engaging in a public screaming match is exactly what a narcissist desires. If you wrestle with a pig in the mud, you both get dirty, but the pig likes it. Reacting emotionally would only validate Judith's claim that I was unstable. I maintained my stoic discipline. I refused to defend myself on Facebook. I ignored the sympathetic, probing glances from acquaintances at the grocery store. I focused entirely on the data. I opened the red accordion folder on my desk. I printed Clara's forwarded text message, clearly displaying Judith's plea for prayers regarding my fictitious mental breakdown. I printed the email from the landscaping firm canceling my private contract. I calculated the exact dollar amount of the lost revenue from that client. I documented the lost income, establishing a direct, quantifiable financial penalty caused by my mother's defamation. I punched holes in the fresh paper and secured the evidence behind the fifth plastic divider tab. The folder grew thicker, heavier, and increasingly lethal. Every lie they told, every reputation they tried to ruin, was meticulously archived. If you have ever had a toxic family member rewrite history to make you the villain, tell me your story in the comments below. It is a profoundly isolating experience to watch people you love weaponize your character to protect their own secrets. But you must remember one crucial truth when dealing with systemic manipulation. Lies run sprints. Receipts run marathons. The Mason family was currently sprinting, high on the adrenaline of their own manufactured narrative. They believed their social influence had successfully insulated Richard from the consequences of his fraud. They believed I was defeated, isolated, and professionally ruined. They settled into a state of smug victory, confident that the storm had passed. They failed to understand that the state justice system does not care about country club gossip or diaper cake baby showers. The state prosecutor cares about evidence, and the evidence was quietly working its way through the judicial pipeline. The family's period of celebration was about to end abruptly. A formal legal document was currently out for delivery, and its arrival would shatter their illusion of safety, proving that cutting me out of the family trust was the most catastrophic mistake they could have possibly made. Winter settled over Bowling Green with a bitter, unyielding cold. The ground froze solid beneath a layer of gray frost. For 60 days, the Mason family lived in a state of manufactured triumph. They operated under the profound delusion that their twin campaigns of financial severance and social defamation had successfully neutralized me. Richard resumed his weekly golf games, securing new municipal contracts with his signature arrogant swagger. Judith returned to her rightful place at the head of the country club planning committee, accepting sympathetic glances from her peers regarding her tragic, unstable daughter. They believed my silence equated to submission. They assumed the state investigation had stalled because their primary obstacle was effectively removed from the board. They failed to understand that the justice system does not operate on a country club timeline. The law moves with deliberate, mechanical precision, gathering momentum in the dark before it strikes. On a frigid Tuesday morning in late February, the gears finally engaged. I was standing in my kitchen, watching the steam rise from my ceramic coffee mug. I had taken the day off from the auditor branch to organize my final case files. The local legal machinery was executing a coordinated maneuver across town. The lead state investigator had sent me a brief, encrypted email an hour prior, notifying me that the formal notices were out for delivery. I pictured the exact sequence of events unfolding. A marked Warren County Sheriff cruiser pulled into the reserved parking lot of Apex Commercial Development. 2 uniformed deputies bypassed the receptionist, walked directly into the executive boardroom, and handed a thick manila envelope to Uncle Richard. At that exact same hour, a civilian process server drove a nondescript sedan up the long, crushed gravel driveway of my grandmother's estate. Judith was hosting her weekly morning brunch for the charity steering committee. The server walked past the imported floral arrangements and handed my mother a matching stack of legal documents. The documents were formal notifications from the state prosecutor's office. They listed the impending trial dates, the specific fraud charges, and the formalized witness roster. My full legal name sat at the very top of that roster. I was not listed as a minor clerical participant or a character witness. I was formally designated as the primary forensic expert witness for the prosecution. I was the state's silver bullet. The reaction was instantaneous. My smartphone rested on the granite kitchen island. The screen illuminated, casting a harsh white glow against the polished stone. The extended family group chat, which had remained dormant since Lauren's baby shower, descended into pure digital chaos. My phone vibrated endlessly, sliding a fraction of an inch across the counter with each new notification. Relatives who had actively ignored me for months were suddenly typing frantic, panicked paragraphs. Aunt Susan demanded to know what was happening. Cousins asked if the news about Richard was true. Judith remained conspicuously absent from the main thread, likely locked in her home office, screaming at her crisis management lawyers. Then, a direct message arrived from my sister. Lauren dropped the curated facade of the serene, expectant mother. Her text message was raw, unfiltered panic. She typed in rapid, broken sentences. "You told us you would not testify. You said you were walking away. You said you were out of this." I stood in my quiet kitchen. The morning sunlight streamed through the frost-covered glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I picked up my mug and took a slow sip of the hot, dark roast. The coffee tasted rich and grounding. I did not feel anger. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication. I felt the cold, sharp edge of inevitability. The bill had finally arrived at their doorstep. I set my ceramic mug back on the granite counter. I picked up my phone. I typed my response with deliberate, measured keystrokes. I said I would not perjure myself. I never said I would not answer a subpoena. I hit send. I watched the tiny digital indicator confirm the delivery. I placed the phone face down on the island. In that exact moment, the horrifying legal reality washed over the entire Mason family. For months, Richard's expensive defense attorneys possessed a highly viable courtroom strategy. If I had remained a 25% equity partner in the family limited partnership, the defense team could have easily impeached my credibility on the witness stand. They could have painted me as a greedy, disgruntled heir. They could have argued to the judge that I possessed a vested financial interest in seeing my uncle removed from power. They could have claimed my forensic audit was nothing more than a biased, hostile takeover attempt fueled by internal family politics. That specific defense strategy required my name to remain on those trust documents. But Richard and Judith were blinded by their need to control me. They thought they were punishing my defiance. They held a formal meeting. They forced a hostile buyout. They legally severed my ties to the estate. They scrubbed my signature from every single shared asset and scrubbed my name from every shared liability. By disinheriting me, they systematically destroyed their own defense. They stripped away my financial conflict of interest. I no longer held any equity in Richard's downfall. I was no longer a relative fighting for control of a lucrative trust fund. I was simply a highly trained, independent state auditor presenting unassailable mathematical evidence to a judge. By legally casting me out into the cold, they accidentally engineered the perfect, unbiased expert witness. No defense attorney in Kentucky could claim I was motivated by inheritance money because my family had publicly and legally ensured I had no inheritance left to gain. They dug their own grave, handed me the shovel, and dared me to use it. The sheer gravity of their catastrophic miscalculation paralyzed them. The country club's smear campaign meant nothing inside a court of law. The rumors of a nervous breakdown would evaporate the second I presented the hard data trail of dummy LLCs and phantom steel shipments. They were trapped in a corner of their own making, and the trial date was rapidly approaching. I walked down the hallway into my home office. I opened my fireproof safe and retrieved the red accordion folder. I needed to begin organizing my exhibits for the prosecutor. I knew the game was entering its final, most unpredictable phase. When a family system built on power realizes they have handed their victim the executioner's sword, they stop playing by polite societal rules. They abandon financial threats and social exile because those weapons hold no remaining value. They aim for the jugular. Lauren realized her luxurious future, her country club standing, and her subsidized lifestyle were evaporating. Her panic rapidly morphed into a vicious, calculated cruelty. She decided that if she could not stop me from walking into that courtroom, she would destroy the one person standing beside me. The darkest night of this entire ordeal was only a few hours away, and the target she chose was David. The eve of a major trial carries a distinct, suffocating gravity. It is a specific kind of quiet, thick with anticipation and the weight of impending consequences. Outside our windows, a late March wind rattled the bare branches of the oak trees in our front yard. The streetlights cast long, shivering shadows across the driveway. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tight. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into the Warren County Courthouse, place my hand on a Bible, and dismantle my uncle's commercial empire under oath. I sat at my home office desk, double-checking my exhibits. I verified the sequence of the routing numbers, the dates on the phantom invoices, and the corresponding weather reports. Everything was organized. Every variable was accounted for. Down the hall, David was sitting in his worn leather armchair. A single brass reading lamp illuminated the stack of trigonometry exams resting on his lap. He held his red grading pen, making quiet, precise marks on the paper. He projected a steady, calming presence. Throughout the entire ordeal, David never complained about the collateral damage bleeding into our lives. He remained my unwavering anchor. My smartphone rested next to my keyboard. At 9:15, the screen lit up. A single text message notification appeared. The sender was my sister, Lauren. I stared at the glowing rectangle. Lauren had not sent me a direct message since the day she mocked me over my fictional failure. I debated ignoring the notification. Engaging with her on the night before my testimony felt like a tactical error. Yet the instinct of a forensic auditor is to always inspect the new data. I reached out, unlocked the device, and opened the message thread. The text consisted of a single, dense paragraph. I saw David at the Elm Street grocery store this past weekend, Lauren wrote. He followed me out to my vehicle. He cornered me against my car door. He made me feel incredibly unsafe. I already drafted a formal police report regarding the harassment. I will file the report tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and I will forward a certified copy directly to the county school board superintendent. We both know what happens to a male teacher accused of harassing a pregnant woman. Stay home tomorrow or he loses his license forever. The air vanished from my lungs. A sudden freezing chill swept through my veins. The threat was vile, baseless, and flawlessly targeted. The Mason family had spent months trying to locate my breaking point. They attempted to buy my loyalty. They tried to leverage my inheritance. They worked to destroy my local reputation. None of those tactics penetrated my armor because they only affected me. I could withstand their cruelty. But Lauren had finally discovered my one true vulnerability. She aimed her weapon at David. The social mechanics of her extortion were terrifyingly viable. In the modern educational system, a public school teacher does not require a criminal conviction to lose their livelihood. The mere allegation of harassing a pregnant woman in a public parking lot would trigger an immediate, catastrophic administrative response. The school board would place David on indefinite unpaid leave pending an investigation. The local news would likely acquire the police report. The parents of his students would demand his removal. Even if the charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, the stain on his reputation would be permanent. His teaching license, his career, and his passion would be systematically destroyed. My hands began to shake. The tremor started in my fingers and radiated up my forearms. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. This was the brink. This was the dark night of the soul. For the first time since uncovering the $1.2 million discrepancy, genuine panic gripped my heart. I could not allow an innocent man to be crucified to serve my family's corrupt agenda. Protecting David was my highest obligation. If saving his career required me to fake an illness and skip the trial, I was prepared to do it. The price of justice suddenly felt too steep. I picked up the phone. My legs felt heavy, as if I were moving through deep water. I walked down the hallway and entered the living room. David looked up from the geometry exam. He noticed my pale face and the visible tremor in my hands. He set his red pen down immediately and stood up from the leather chair. He did not ask what was wrong. He stepped forward and held out his hand. I gave him the phone. I watched his eyes track back and forth across the glowing screen as he read Lauren's extortion threat. I waited for the shock to register on his face. I braced myself for the anger, the fear, or the profound anxiety of a man facing the sudden end of his professional life. David finished reading the paragraph. He looked away from the screen and met my gaze. He did not panic. His breathing remained perfectly steady. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, forming a faint, tired smile. He handed the smartphone back to me. He gestured toward the coffee table. "Sit down, Madeline," he said quietly. I lowered myself onto the edge of the sofa. David walked over to the media console and picked up his laptop. He brought it back to the coffee table, opened the screen, and typed in his administrative password. He launched the proprietary software application linked to the commercial-grade security cameras he installed on our roofline months ago. Lauren claimed I cornered her at the Elm Street grocery store this past weekend, David noted, his voice carrying the calm, instructive tone he used in his classroom. He navigated the software interface. The program accessed a secure, encrypted cloud server holding weeks of high-definition surveillance footage. The system ran 24 hours a day, capturing every angle of our front yard, the driveway, the side gate, and the backyard patio. David selected the chronological timeline for the previous Saturday and Sunday. He filtered the search to track any motion involving his vehicle. He turned the laptop screen toward me. "Look at the timestamp," he said. I focused on the digital video feed. The footage showed David standing on the back patio early Saturday morning. He was wearing his gray sweatshirt, operating a high-pressure power washer to clean the wooden deck boards. I watched the timestamp scroll forward. At noon, he was sitting at the patio table, grading papers in the afternoon sun. On Sunday morning, the front driveway camera showed him assembling a wooden birdhouse near the open garage door. My eyes scanned the digital clock running in the corner of the video player. Hour by hour, the cameras provided a seamless, unbroken narrative of his weekend. "My truck never left the driveway," David stated. "I never started the engine. I never walked past the property line. I did not visit the Elm Street grocery store or any other store for the entire 48-hour period." The sheer magnitude of his ironclad alibi washed over me. When David mounted those cameras to the eaves of our house, he was anticipating physical retaliation. He wanted to document any trespassing attempts by Richard or my mother. He inadvertently created a perfect, unassailable timeline of his own existence. If Lauren walked into the police station and filed a formal harassment report detailing an encounter at the grocery store, she would be committing a severe crime. The moment the local authorities cross-referenced her statement with David's timestamp security footage, her fabrication would instantly collapse. Filing a false police report is a Class A misdemeanor. Extorting a state witness is a felony. Lauren was not holding a loaded gun to David's career. She was holding a live hand grenade, entirely unaware that the pin was already pulled. The paralyzing fear in my chest evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, finalizing clarity. Any lingering ghost of sisterly affection, any microscopic shred of familial obligation I still harbored, turned to ash. A sister might be blinded by a toxic mother. A sister might act out of misplaced loyalty to an uncle. But only a predator attempts to frame an innocent man to protect a thief. Lauren was no longer family. She was an extortionist. I stood up from the sofa. I looked at David. The faint smile was still resting on his lips. "Thank you," I whispered. "I always show my work," he replied softly. I turned and walked back to my home office. I did not feel the need to respond to Lauren's text. Warning her about the camera footage would only give her the opportunity to pivot and invent a different lie. Letting her walk blindly into her own trap was the only logical course of action. I connected my smartphone to the laser printer. I initiated the printing sequence. The machine hummed, pulling a fresh sheet of bond paper through the toner rollers. Lauren's vile threat emerged in crisp, black text. I opened my bottom desk drawer and pulled out the red accordion folder. I uncapped my black pen. I wrote item number 42 across the top margin of the printed text message. I punched 2 holes in the paper and secured it behind the final plastic divider tab. I closed the thick, heavy cover of the folder. The archive was complete. The ledger was closed. The Mason family had emptied their entire arsenal. They spent months deploying guilt, isolation, financial severance, character assassination, and extortion. Every single weapon shattered against the wall of rigorous documentation. I picked up my leather professional briefcase. I unzipped the main compartment. I lifted the red folder and placed it squarely inside, right on top of my legal notepads and spare pens. I zipped the briefcase shut and set it by the front door. I walked into the bedroom and set my digital alarm clock for 5 o'clock in the morning. I turned off the bedside lamp. The house plunged into a quiet, peaceful darkness. I closed my eyes, feeling steady and prepared. The long night of the soul was over. Tomorrow, the heavy oak doors of the Warren County Courthouse would swing open, and I was going to read the truth into the public record. The narrative circle closed right where it began. The heavy oak doors of the Warren County Courthouse swung inward. The bailiff called my name. I stepped out of the sterile waiting room and crossed the threshold into the main judicial chamber. The air inside the room felt dense, carrying the distinct scent of polished mahogany, old paper, and nervous energy. The gallery was packed beyond its standard capacity. I recognized local journalists sitting in the front rows, holding digital recorders and yellow legal pads. Behind them sat a sea of familiar faces from the Bowling Green Country Club, various church committees, and local business owners. They had come for a spectacle. They had consumed my mother's toxic rumors for months, and they arrived expecting to witness the final, public unraveling of a disgraced and unstable daughter. I walked down the center aisle. My posture remained straight. My footsteps fell in a steady, measured rhythm against the carpeted floor. Uncle Richard sat at the primary defense table. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost upward of $3,000, paired with a subtle silk tie. He leaned back in his leather chair, projecting the relaxed, untouchable aura of a man who firmly believed he owned the building. He whispered something to his lead counsel, a high-priced corporate litigator imported from a prestigious firm in Chicago. Richard did not look like a man facing federal fraud charges. He looked like a CEO preparing to fire an insubordinate employee. Directly behind the wooden partition separating the gallery from the trial floor sat my mother and my sister. Judith wore a tailored navy dress and her signature pearl necklace. Her spine was rigid. Lauren sat next to her, clutching a designer leather handbag on her lap. When I walked past their row, Lauren narrowed her eyes into dark, hostile slits. She glared at me, radiating a silent, venomous fury. Her extortion attempt from the previous night hung in the air between us. She was waiting for me to cower. She expected me to fake an illness, request a recess, or run out of the double doors to protect David from her fabricated police report. I did not break my stride. I did not look away. I offered them a blank, clinical stare before turning my attention to the front of the room. I stepped into the witness box. I raised my right hand, swore the formal oath to tell the truth, and took my seat. I adjusted the small black microphone positioned on the wooden ledge. Before the state prosecutor could utter a single word to begin his direct examination, the Chicago litigator stood up from the defense table. He buttoned his suit jacket and addressed the presiding judge. "Your Honor, the defense raises a formal objection to the competency of this witness," the lawyer announced. His voice was smooth, carrying a practiced theatrical resonance designed to echo through the gallery. "We request the immediate disqualification of Madeline Mason as an expert financial witness for the state." A low murmur rippled through the spectators sitting behind me. The judge, an older man with gray hair and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, picked up his wooden gavel and tapped it once against his desk. He instructed the defense counsel to state his specific legal grounds. The litigator walked out from behind his table and paced slowly toward the center of the floor. "This witness is not an impartial state investigator, Your Honor. She is an estranged, disgruntled heir carrying a profound personal vendetta against my client. Just 2 months ago, she was formally stripped of her 25% equity stake in the Mason Family Limited Partnership due to erratic and hostile behavior. Furthermore, it is a matter of public record within her community that she recently suffered a severe psychological crisis. Her findings are not forensic facts. They are the paranoid delusions of a bitter daughter seeking financial revenge for her disinheritance." The strategy was ruthless and highly effective. The defense was deploying Judith's smear campaign directly into the official court record. They were attempting to put my sanity on trial before I could present a single spreadsheet. I sat in the witness chair. I did not grip the wooden rails. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not unleash a frantic, emotional defense of my mental health. A panicked reaction would only validate their accusation. I maintained my stoic discipline. I kept my breathing slow and even. I acted exactly like a forensic auditor facing a hostile corporate audit. The state prosecutor, a methodical man named Harrison, stood up. He did not yell. He simply asked the judge if the defense counsel had provided any certified medical records, psychiatric evaluations, or hospital admission forms to substantiate their extravagant claims regarding my mental fitness. The judge looked down at the Chicago litigator. "Do you have medical documentation to support this allegation, counselor?" The defense attorney paused. His smooth demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second. "We possess numerous testimonies from prominent community members regarding her deteriorating state of mind, Your Honor." The judge let out a heavy sigh. "This is a court of law, counselor, not a country club steering committee. I do not disqualify expert state witnesses based on local gossip. Your objection is overruled. Take your seat." A sharp, collective intake of breath echoed from the gallery. The litigator offered a tight, forced nod and retreated to the defense table. Richard's relaxed posture vanished. He sat forward, planting his elbows on the polished wood, his jaw clenching tight. Harrison stepped up to the wooden podium. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The state prosecutor did not ask me how I felt about my family. He did not inquire about my childhood or my inheritance. He asked me to state my professional credentials, my years of service in the auditor branch, and my specific role in the municipal zoning investigation. I answered his questions with a level, emotionless cadence. Harrison turned away from the podium and faced the judge. "Your Honor, the state requests permission to enter our primary forensic dossier into the public record as Exhibit C." The judge granted the request. Harrison walked over to the prosecutor's table. He lifted a heavy, black legal binder. He carried it across the room and handed it to the Chicago litigator. He handed a second identical binder to the court clerk. He carried the final copy to the witness stand and placed it on the wooden ledge directly in front of me. The black binder was the official, itemized copy of my red accordion folder. I looked over at the defense table. The Chicago litigator opened the thick binder to review the contents. Richard leaned over his lawyer's shoulder to inspect the documents. I watched the exact moment my uncle realized he was trapped. Exhibit C did not merely contain the financial spreadsheets proving the $1.2 million construction fraud. It contained the entire documented history of his cover-up. Richard stared at the first page. It was the printed text message from Judith, time-stamped at 11:14 at night, ordering me to fix the audit. He turned the page. He saw a pristine photocopy of the fake, notarized software glitch affidavit he had tried to force me to sign in my own kitchen. He turned another page and saw the $50,000 Vanguard Educational Initiative consulting contract paired with my forensic routing trace linking the dummy corporation directly to his personal bank accounts. The blood drained from Richard's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. A visible sheen of sweat formed along his hairline. He looked up from the binder and stared at me. The arrogant, untouchable developer was gone. He was looking at the architect of his impending prison sentence. In the gallery, Judith stretched her neck, trying to see the documents causing her brother to panic. Lauren sat frozen, her eyes darting nervously between the judge and the prosecutor. They could feel the ground giving way beneath their feet. Harrison stood near the podium. "Miss Mason," he said, his voice clear and resonant, "could you please open Exhibit C and direct the court to page 14. I reached out and grasped the cover of the heavy binder. I opened it. I placed my fingers on the metal rings holding the hundreds of pages together. I pulled them apart. The sharp, metallic click echoed through the silent courtroom like the sound of a vault locking shut. I found the requested page. I smoothed the paper flat. I looked up at the judge, ready to read the unassailable truth into the public record, knowing that the real plot twist of the morning was still waiting to be revealed. I placed my hands flat against the wooden ledge of the witness box. I did not look at my mother or my sister in the gallery. I focused my vision entirely on the prosecutor, Harrison, and the heavy black binder resting in front of me. The air in the courtroom was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the municipal air conditioning system vibrating through the ceiling vents. Harrison walked to the center of the floor. "Miss Mason," he began, his tone professional and measured, "let us start with the core of the state's investigation into Apex Commercial Development. Please describe the financial irregularities you discovered regarding the Warren County Transit Center project." I opened the first section of the binder. I did not rely on hyperbole or dramatic adjectives. I delivered a masterclass in forensic accounting. I spoke with the clinical precision of a surgeon operating on a balance sheet. I detailed the specific dates in the third fiscal quarter when Bluegrass Supply Holdings billed the county for 40 tons of industrial steel framing. I read the 9-digit routing numbers out loud. I explained the digital architecture of the Phantom LLC registered in Delaware. I cited the daily weather logs from the construction site, proving severe rain delays prevented any material deliveries on the invoiced dates. The math was indisputable. The paper trail was absolute. The Chicago litigator stood up from the defense table. He attempted to fracture my momentum. "Your Honor, the defense acknowledges the billing discrepancies," he interjected. "However, a discrepancy is not a crime. In a complex multi-million-dollar municipal project, administrative oversight happens. This was merely an accounting error caused by a flawed software migration, not a deliberate fraud." He was clinging to the fake narrative they had designed months ago. It was a desperate, calculated gamble. Harrison did not argue. He simply turned to me and nodded. I flipped to the second tab in my binder. I pulled out a pristine, plastic-sleeved document. It was item 14 from my original red folder. I held the document up for the judge to see. "This is a sworn, notarized affidavit," I stated clearly. "The defendant brought this document to my private residence on a Tuesday evening in November. The text explicitly outlines the exact software migration error the defense counsel just cited. The defendant demanded that I sign this document, recuse myself from the audit, and officially certify the fraud as a technological glitch." The judge leaned forward, squinting down at the paperwork. "You are testifying that the defendant attempted to coerce you into signing a pre-written statement exonerating him." "Yes, Your Honor. I refused, as doing so would constitute perjury." The litigator scrambled to recover. "Your Honor, the defense objects. This witness harbors a profound personal animosity against her uncle. She is currently wielding this fabricated story as a weapon of family vendetta because she was recently removed from the family estate." Harrison walked over to the digital projector resting on a small metal cart. He connected his laptop and activated the screen behind the judge's bench. "Let us address the defense's claim of a family vendetta," Harrison said. An image flashed onto the large white screen. It was item 28. The entire courtroom stared at the high-resolution scan of the Vanguard Educational Initiative contract. Below the corporate logo sat a scanned copy of the $50,000 cashier's check made out to David Mason. "Miss Mason," Harrison prompted, "please explain the document currently displayed for the court." I adjusted the microphone. "That is an employment contract delivered to my husband following my removal from the family limited partnership. It offered a $50,000 upfront signing bonus for a remote consulting position. During a subsequent forensic trace, I discovered the routing numbers associated with the Vanguard LLC were registered to the exact same holding company currently double billing the county taxpayers. The defendant attempted to launder a bribe through my husband's professional record to purchase my silence." The silence in the gallery was profound. The Chicago litigator sank back into his chair, realizing his entire defense strategy had just shattered against a reinforced wall of physical evidence. He could not claim an accounting error when the state possessed the fraudulent affidavit. He could not claim a family vendetta when the state possessed the corporate bribe. Uncle Richard sat motionless, his face frozen in a mask of pale, suffocating terror. But my testimony was not finished. The state prosecutor possessed one final exhibit, a critical piece of financial data that I had uncovered during my deep dive into Richard's secondary shell companies. It was the plot twist that would not only secure the federal conviction, but permanently sever the psychological grip my family held over my life. Harrison walked back to the podium. Miss Mason, during your forensic trace of the dummy corporations, did you uncover any additional irregularities regarding the defendant's collateral obligations? I flipped to the 4th tab in my binder. I looked past the prosecutor. I looked directly at the gallery, locking eyes with my mother and my sister for the first time since taking the stand. Yes, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, flat register. I discovered that the phantom LLCs were not exclusively billing the county. The defendant required substantial capital to launch those dummy corporations and secure the initial construction contracts. To acquire that capital, he utilized significant leverage. I paused, letting the word hang in the air. I reviewed the commercial loan originations for Apex Commercial Development, I continued. The defendant used the Mason Family Limited Partnership as the primary collateral to underwrite the fraudulent municipal loans. Furthermore, when the state initiated this investigation, the defendant required immediate liquidity to secure high-priced legal representation. The forensic audit confirms that over the past 4 months, the defendant systematically skimmed $400,000 directly from Lauren Mason's personal trust fund to pay his defense attorneys. A sharp, collective gasp ripped through the courtroom. The sound was visceral, echoing off the high plaster ceilings. In the gallery, the curated facade of the Mason family disintegrated in real time. Judith's face drained of all color. The rigid, aristocratic matriarch who commanded the country club slumped against the wooden pew as if she had been physically struck. Her brother had not merely engaged in corporate fraud. He had bet the entire family dynasty on a rigged game, using her daughter's future as collateral. Lauren let out a sudden, audible sob. She slapped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and pure devastation. The golden child, who had sent me vile extortion threats to protect her uncle, realized in an instant that the man she was defending was actively robbing her blind. They sat in the gallery, suffocating under the weight of their own catastrophic miscalculations. They had spent months isolating me. They orchestrated a smear campaign to brand me insane. They legally excommunicated me from the family trust to punish my defiance. They did all of this to protect the very predator who was dismantling their wealth from the inside. They realized in front of a packed courtroom and the local media that they had aggressively excommunicated the only person who possessed the data required to protect them. The judge banged his gavel twice, demanding order in the court. The heavy wooden sound echoed above the rising murmur of the gallery. Harrison looked at the defense table. The Chicago litigator had his head resting in his hands. Richard stared straight ahead, his eyes vacant, recognizing that his commercial empire and his freedom were simultaneously vaporizing. Harrison turned back to the judge. "The state has no further questions for this witness, Your Honor." The judge looked down at me from his elevated bench. His expression held a quiet, respectful acknowledgement of the unassailable evidence resting in my binder. "You may step down, Miss Mason." I closed the heavy black cover of Exhibit C. The metal rings remained securely locked. I stood up from the witness chair. I did not look at the defense table. I did not cast a final glance of pity toward the gallery. I walked down the center aisle, feeling the intense gaze of the spectators tracking my every step. My posture remained flawless. My breathing was perfectly steady. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped out into the hallway. The stale courtroom air vanished, replaced by the cool draft of the corridor. David was standing near the large glass windows at the end of the hall. He wore his gray wool coat. He was holding my leather briefcase. I walked toward him. He did not ask how the testimony went. He did not demand details of the destruction. He simply held out his hand. I took it. We walked out of the Warren County Courthouse together, stepping into the bright, sharp sunlight of the late afternoon. I was bulletproof, vindicated, and completely free. The trial concluded rapidly after that. A defense built on lies cannot survive a direct collision with forensic truth. The state judicial machinery engaged its final gears, moving to deliver a verdict and exact a penalty that would forever alter the financial landscape of Bowling Green. The collateral damage I had warned my family about was no longer a theoretical threat. It was an impending administrative reality, and the state collection agencies were preparing to seize the very assets my mother and sister had so proudly voted to deny me. The conclusion of a highly publicized trial rarely brings immediate closure. The verdict is simply the initial shockwave. The true devastation lies in the administrative fallout that follows. 2 weeks after I closed the black binder and walked out of the Warren County Courthouse, the judge delivered his final ruling. The decision was sweeping, merciless, and broadcast across every local news network in southern Kentucky. Uncle Richard was found guilty on all primary counts of municipal fraud, witness tampering, and gross financial negligence. The judge did not stop at a simple criminal conviction. He aimed directly at the commercial arteries of Apex Commercial Development. He hit the firm with $3 million in restitution, punitive damages, and state administrative fines. The ruling was designed to strip the corporation down to its foundation and salt the earth beneath it. Richard, the untouchable developer who funded judicial campaigns and played golf with governors, was sentenced to 48 months in a federal correctional facility. The arrogant swagger evaporated. The bespoke suits were replaced by standard-issue prison uniforms. The empire he built on dummy LLCs and phantom steel shipments collapsed inward. However, a $3 million penalty requires immediate liquidity. The court demanded satisfaction, and Richard's personal accounts were heavily over-leveraged. This triggered a secondary, catastrophic legal mechanism. The state collection agencies initiated a comprehensive asset forfeiture protocol. They needed to find the money to pay the restitution. This is where the lethal architecture of my uncle's greed intersected with the supreme irony of my mother's malice. During the trial, I had entered the collateral documentation into the public record. The state prosecutor now possessed irrefutable proof that Richard had utilized the Mason Family Limited Partnership to secure the commercial loans for his fraudulent shell companies. In the eyes of the law, the family trust was not a separate protected entity. It was an active financial accomplice. Because Richard tied the crimes directly to the shared estate, the presiding judge authorized the state to pierce the corporate veil. The speed of a state asset seizure is terrifying. It operates with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. On a Tuesday morning, a team of court-appointed receivers arrived at my grandmother's sprawling colonial mansion. They did not knock politely. They presented a federal warrant. They systematically froze every single bank account tied to the Family Limited Partnership. They locked the investment portfolios. They placed immediate liens on the commercial properties. The $4 million estate, the crown jewel of the Mason family dynasty, was officially seized by the state of Kentucky. The court initiated a rapid liquidation process. The properties were scheduled for public auction. The investment accounts were drained to satisfy the $3 million restitution order. The remainder was consumed by legal fees, court costs, and administrative penalties. The absolute delicious irony of the situation settled over Bowling Green like a heavy blanket. Just 3 months prior, my mother and my sister had summoned me to that very estate. They sat around the mahogany dining table, flanked by high-priced lawyers, and proudly voted to strip me of my 25% equity stake. They forced a hostile buyout, scrubbing my name from every shared asset and liability, fully believing they were executing the ultimate punishment. They thought they were sending me into financial exile. In reality, they performed a legal miracle on my behalf. By forcing the buyout and legally severing my ties to the Family Limited Partnership, they inadvertently built an impenetrable firewall around my personal finances. When the state pierced the corporate veil and seized the estate, my name was nowhere on the ledger. My modest ranch house on Coldwater Lane, my state pension, and my private savings accounts remained completely untouched. The state collection agencies possessed zero jurisdiction over my assets because my family had legally certified my estrangement. My mother and my sister bankrupted themselves to protect a criminal, while simultaneously executing the precise legal maneuvers necessary to shield the very daughter they threw away. The country club matriarch, who had spent decades curating an image of pristine wealth and influence, was suddenly facing financial ruin. The luxury SUVs were repossessed. The annual club memberships were revoked due to non-payment. Lauren, the golden child whose life was built on unconditional subsidies, watched her remaining trust fund evaporate to cover her uncle's initial defense costs. They were left with nothing but the smoldering ash of a burned-down dynasty. The silence from their side of town was profound. There were no more manipulative group chat messages. There were no more weeping voicemails from Aunt Susan. There were no more pre-written affidavits delivered to my kitchen island. The psychological warfare ended because the opposing army had run out of ammunition and capital. I did not celebrate their downfall. I did not log on to social media to gloat. I maintained my quiet routine. I continued waking up at 5 a.m. to the smell of David's dark roast coffee. I continued driving to the auditor branch, reviewing municipal vendor disbursements. Our lives remained small, predictable, and deeply safe. The fortress we built held strong against the storm. However, a family dynamic structured entirely around transactional loyalty cannot sustain prolonged silence when the resources run dry. People accustomed to demanding bailouts eventually run out of strangers to manipulate. When the reality of their poverty set in and the rented townhouses began to feel small, I knew they would attempt one final maneuver. They would assume that blood obligation could resurrect a bridge they had intentionally burned. They would believe that my quiet nature indicated a lingering weakness they could exploit. 6 months after the gavel fell, the ghosts of the Mason family would appear on my doorstep, seeking the very sanctuary they had previously mocked. The final confrontation was approaching, and it would require me to issue one last invoice to close the ledger permanently. 6 months drifted past Bowling Green with a quiet, measured grace. The scorching heat of the Kentucky summer gradually surrendered to the crisp, clear air of late September. The changing seasons mirrored the profound shift in my own life. The relentless psychological tension that once governed my daily routine vanished, replaced by an expansive, unshakable peace. The state judicial machinery finished processing the ruins of Uncle Richard's commercial empire. He was transferred to a federal correctional facility in a neighboring state, assigned a rigid inmate number, and stripped of his remaining influence. The local news cycle eventually moved on to other scandals. I did not stop working. I continued my duties at the state auditor branch, tracing municipal ledgers and ensuring public funds reached their proper destinations. My private tax preparation business flourished, acquiring several new, high-value clients who appreciated an accountant possessing an unassailable track record of integrity. David and I maintained our predictable, quiet existence. We saved our income. We managed our private accounts. We kept our eyes focused on the local county registry, waiting for a very specific piece of data to appear on the public server. When the state pierces a corporate veil and seizes a multi-million-dollar trust, the liquidation process is rarely immediate. The court-appointed receivers must assess the properties, clear the preliminary titles, and list the real estate on the county auction block. I tracked the bureaucratic progress of my grandmother's colonial mansion every single morning. I understood the mechanics of a foreclosure auction better than any real estate agent in the region. On a Friday morning, the listing finally went live. The state required a rapid sale to satisfy the lingering balance of Richard's court-ordered restitution. Because the estate was tainted by federal fraud, the starting bid dropped significantly below the standard market valuation. David and I drove to the county clerk building. We submitted our bid. We utilized the accumulated capital we had secured over years of disciplined saving, combined with the funds I retained by allowing my family to legally force me out of the contaminated trust. We won the auction. The gavel fell, and the title transferred directly into our names. The following afternoon, a Saturday, David and I were sitting on the front porch of our modest ranch house on Coldwater Lane. The neighborhood was quiet. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree in our front yard. David sat in a wooden rocking chair, reading a thick, hardcover biography. I rested on the porch swing, holding a glass of iced tea, watching the condensation bead against the cold glass. The quiet rhythm of the afternoon broke when a vehicle turned onto our street. It was not the luxury SUV my mother used to drive to her charity luncheons. It was a faded, 10-year-old sedan with a cracked front bumper and a rattling exhaust pipe. The car pulled into our driveway, the tires crunching loudly against the concrete. The engine sputtered before shutting off. The driver's side door creaked open. My mother stepped out into the sunlight. The curated country club veneer was entirely gone. Judith wore a simple, unbranded gray sweater and dark slacks. Her posture lacked the rigid, aristocratic authority she once weaponized against me. Her shoulders slumped forward, carrying the heavy, invisible burden of sudden poverty. The rear passenger door opened. Lauren emerged, holding a bulky plastic infant carrier. The golden child, whose lavish wedding and designer wardrobe were once funded by a fraudulent empire, looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. She held the car seat against her hip, refusing to make eye contact with me or David. They walked slowly up the concrete path toward the porch steps. I did not stand up to greet them. I placed my glass of iced tea on the small wooden side table. David lowered his book, resting it on his knee, his expression blank and unreadable. Judith stopped at the base of the wooden stairs. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with moisture, initiating the familiar theatrical weeping she had deployed for decades to manipulate her surroundings. She believed the old script still held power. She assumed that blood obligation could resurrect a bridge she had intentionally burned to the ground. "Madeline, please," Judith said, her voice cracking with manufactured vulnerability. "We have nothing left. The lawyers took everything. The bank took the cars. We are living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town." She gestured toward Lauren and the sleeping infant. "Lauren's baby needs a proper home," Judith continued, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "You have a stable income. You have extra space in this house. We are your family. Family helps family." I looked down at the 2 women standing in my driveway. The sheer audacity of their arrival was a testament to the core delusion of a narcissistic family system. They spent an entire year attempting to destroy my career, my reputation, and my husband. They voted to strip me of my inheritance to protect a thief. When their weapons failed and their wealth evaporated, they simply rebooted their strategy. They returned to the designated scapegoat. They expected the reliable backup plan to fulfill her designated role and absorb their deficit. They thought my quiet nature equated to a lingering weakness. They assumed my lack of public retaliation meant I still secretly craved their approval. I stood up from the porch swing. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a lecture on morality or a bitter recounting of their betrayal. Emotional displays are currency for manipulators, and I refused to fund their drama. I reached toward the small wooden side table. Resting beneath my sunglasses was a pristine manila folder. I picked it up and walked to the edge of the top step. I did not offer them an invitation to come inside. I did not offer them a check. I opened the folder and extracted a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. It was a certified public document bearing the raised seal of the Warren County Clerk. I extended my arm, holding the paper out toward my mother. Judith hesitated, then reached up and took the document. Her eyes scanned the bold text printed across the top margin. "When the state liquidated the estate, grandmother's house went up for a foreclosure auction," I stated. My voice was level, projecting the clinical tone of an auditor delivering a final ruling. "David and I bought it yesterday, in cash." Lauren let out a sharp, audible gasp. Her grip tightened on the plastic handle of the infant carrier. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and crushing defeat. Judith's hands began to tremble. She stared at the property deed, registering the reality of the names printed on the ownership line. The sprawling colonial mansion, the ultimate symbol of the Mason family dynasty, the very estate they had proudly voted to banish me from, now belonged exclusively to the daughter they threw away. I reached into the manila folder a second time. I pulled out another piece of paper. It was a standardized municipal invoice. I held it out. Judith took the second document, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. "I also paid the back taxes you ignored before the foreclosure," I said. "I believe you owe me $4,200, Mom. I accept cashier's checks." I did not wait for a response. I did not wait for the inevitable excuses, the weeping, or the desperate pleas for shelter. The transaction was complete. The ledger was balanced. I turned my back on the driveway. I walked across the wooden porch. David stood up, tucked his book under his arm, and followed me into the house. I stepped over the threshold, grasped the brass handle of the front door, and pulled it shut. The heavy oak door met the frame with a quiet, final click. The deadbolt slid smoothly into place, securing the boundary forever. They thought love was a budget they could cut me out of. They didn't realize I was the one keeping the books. Share this video, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. The sound of a heavy oak door clicking shut is a deceptive thing. It is a brief, quiet mechanical action, taking less than a second to complete. Yet the resonance can echo through the corridors of a family's history for generations. In the profound silence that follows a final boundary being drawn, we are forced to examine the architecture of the house we just secured. The saga of the Mason family is not merely a narrative about corporate ledgers, unearned inheritances, or forensic audits. It serves as a stark, uncompromising mirror held up to the foundational values of the American family, asking us to evaluate the true cost of the legacies we pass down to our children. In our culture, the traditional family structure is idealized as an impenetrable sanctuary. We envision the dining room table as a place of unconditional support, where moral compasses are calibrated and emotional safety is guaranteed. But what happens when that table transforms into a corporate boardroom? When we look closely at Judith's approach to motherhood, we witness the devastating long-term effects of transactional parenting. She did not raise daughters, she managed assets. Love, in the Mason household, was treated as a finite budget, allocated only to those who preserved the pristine image of the country club facade. This exposes a critical fracture in how we understand fairness and emotional awareness in child rearing. Fairness in parenting does not equate to identical presents under a holiday tree or matching college funds. True fairness requires an equitable emotional investment in who a child actually is, rather than what they can do for the family's social standing. By designating Lauren as the golden child, handing her platinum credit cards, shielding her from consequences, and funding her lavish milestones, Judith believed she was providing a superior life. In reality, she was crippling her youngest daughter. She raised a woman incapable of weathering a storm, dependent on a steady stream of unearned capital. When the fraudulent empire collapsed, Lauren possessed no internal fortitude to survive the wreckage. She had never been taught the quiet, unglamorous dignity of resilience. Conversely, Madeline was relegated to the role of the family calculator, the reliable backup plan expected to clean up the deficits. While this isolation forged a formidable, hyper-competent adult, it was a profound abdication of parental duty. A child should never have to earn their place at the table by balancing the household checkbook or proving their quiet utility. Emotional awareness demands that a parent recognize the inherent, non-negotiable worth of their child. When parents fail to provide that unconditional emotional baseline, they do not just lose the child's trust, they forfeit the privilege of being part of that child's eventual success. Furthermore, we must confront the true definition of family responsibility. The phrase, "family helps family," is a beautiful, necessary sentiment. It is the invisible mortar that binds generations together through hardship, illness, and economic uncertainty. However, the Mason family weaponized that sentiment, twisting it into a demand for blind, immoral allegiance. Uncle Richard invoked blood ties to demand perjury. He expected his niece to sacrifice her career, her state license, and her integrity to protect his illicit bank accounts. True family responsibility requires honesty, even when the truth is deeply uncomfortable. Protecting a child or a sibling does not mean shielding them from accountability. When a family system covers up deceit, when it demands silence in the face of wrongdoing, it teaches the next generation that truth is a negotiable currency. A traditional family thrives only when its foundation is rooted in a shared moral reality. If you teach a child that their primary obligation is to protect the family's image at all costs, you are not raising a responsible adult. You are raising a participant in a syndicate. Guiding a child through the complexities of modern American life requires more than paying for braces or securing a prestigious address. It requires the courage to let them witness you making hard, ethical choices. It requires parents to apologize when they are wrong, demonstrating that humility is a strength, not a liability. If Judith had possessed the emotional awareness to say no to her brother's initial overreach, or the integrity to demand Lauren pay her own debts, the tragic collapse of their dynasty could have been avoided. Instead, the pursuit of an illusion blinded them to the impending reality of their own moral bankruptcy. The most vital inheritance a parent can leave behind is not a commercial property, a limited partnership, or a $4 million estate. Wealth can be seized. Estates can be liquidated. Influence can evaporate in the span of a single afternoon inside a county courtroom. The only enduring inheritance is a functioning moral compass. We must raise children who know how to stand on their own 2 feet, who value the quiet peace of a clean conscience over the loud applause of a country club. We must build homes where the ledgers of love are never kept, and where the doors remain open only to those who respect the sanctuary within. If this story resonated with you, if you are navigating the complex, often painful ledgers of your own family dynamics, you are not walking that path alone. We explore these quiet battles and the triumph of setting firm boundaries every week. Please subscribe to the channel or A Vengeance, drop a comment sharing your own journey, and join a community that understands the true value of keeping the receipts. As we look out the window at the changing seasons, we are left to ponder the invisible structures of our own lives. The children we raise today will eventually inherit the reality we build for them. They will sift through the choices we made, the truths we defended, and the lies we allowed to flourish. We all draft a final invoice, whether we intend to or not. When the day comes for your ledger to be audited by the ones who come after you, what will the numbers reveal? Will they find a fortress built on quiet integrity, or a fragile house of cards waiting for the wind to change? The pen is in your hand, and the ink is permanent.